Hi there. Good morning. Thank you, Dave. I have to tell you, I get goosebumps looking out this crowd and seeing all these people here today to talk about this important problem. I have to admit to you, when we were talking about it 6 or 7 years ago, we got a lot of blank stares from people. They really didn't understand what we were concerned about. And I'm going to talk about it in a little bit, but the basic reason for that was something that Dave alluded to. And I think those of you who are here today who are not from the education community, but otherwise from your community need to know the dropout rate in America didn't just drop by 20% in the last 5 or 6 years. What's really happened is that we're counting much better today, much more accurately today than we were before. And so we're highlighting for America a problem that we've had for quite some time now. I want to thank Jim and Judy for having us here today. Tony, who is a great friend, and I believe a great friend to education. Dave Adams and Tom Zobel, our principal in Shelbyville, who've been great friends to me in this effort. And I want to mention a person today that is a Hoosier and has been a very big part of this topic emerging nationally, who may not be here today. I don't know if he is, but Stan Jones, the former Indiana Commissioner for Higher Education, was somebody that, along with Dave Adams, brought this issue to me. As Dave mentioned, Shelbyville and the state of Indiana found ourselves on the front line of this topic about 4 years ago when Time Magazine decided to feature Shelbyville, really, as Dave alluded to, not because we had an extraordinarily bad problem, but because our demographics shaped up to just about the national average and our graduation rate was just about the national average. And so they felt like by profiling Shelbyville, they could maybe tell a story that applied in a way far beyond that. We'll talk about that again in a minute. You're going to hear from many experts today. I'm more on the citizen side than somebody who's an expert as a PhD in education or anything like that. But you're all here today, I think, as an indication you understand the importance of this problem both nationally and to the individual lives, as Tony said, those faces that deal with this crisis and throughout the rest of their lives. Others can probably tell you all the details, but suffice to say this, we would improve our national economy by billions of dollars if we moved the dropout rate by just a few percentage points. And studies show that for the individual, it can make tens of thousands of dollars a year in income difference just over the question of whether you've graduated from high school or not. I'll give you one statistic that's been quoted to me a long time, but just to give you an idea, 90% of our prison inmates are dropouts. That's not to say that 90% of our dropouts are prison inmates, but 90% of our prison inmates are dropouts. And this is a big deal. That's why you're here today, and we appreciate that. I want to tell you a quick story. I'll give you 3 or 4 or 5 little wisdoms that I've found in my time dealing with this topic. The first is there really is no silver bullet solution to the dropout crisis. Those of you who are educators, you know that, but it's important worth saying. I'm reminded of a story. How many here remember Yakov Smirnoff? Remember Yakov Smirnoff? He was the comedian, particularly of the 80s, when he was from Soviet Russia, and he would talk a lot about the wonders of America when he would come here. And he told a story going through an American grocery store. He'd go down one aisle and he saw powdered tea. You just add water and poof, you have tea. Another aisle, he saw powdered orange juice. You just add water and poof, you've got orange juice. Third aisle, powdered milk. You just add water and poof, you've got milk. He went down a fourth aisle and he saw baby powder. And he said, "Oh, what a country," right? And, the truth of the matter is that some problems don't have just add water solutions. Some take a little while, and I think this problem falls far closer to that range. We're doing some good things in Indiana. We've got a lot more to do, and we won't get there overnight. I'm going to tell you what I believe is the most important reform that we've passed in Indiana in the last 4 or 5 years on the dropout issue, maybe on education in general. I believe it's true nationally as well. And that is our reform in the way that we calculate graduation rates. Dave alluded to it with our specific class. I think he meant that we have 300 in the beginning and about 200, not 100 in the end. But it was roughly about 2/3 of our kids that were were graduating. And for those of you particularly here who aren't from the education community, for really decades, all across the nation, Indiana was no different than anybody else, for someone to qualify, it's a little more complicated than this, but the essence of it was this: for someone to qualify as a dropout, you had to show up for school your senior year and then drop out during that year. As a consequence, almost every school in the country had an 80, 85, 90% graduation rate. What researchers found, and they were understanding this and starting a national reform movement before the Oprah Winfrey Show and Time Magazine and others jumped on this, but was that a much more accurate way of counting, and again, it's a little more complicated than this, but the essence of it is that you would look at your freshman class, look at your senior class, and if you cannot identify a specific place that a student has transferred to, you're going to count them as a dropout. And what you find is that when you count that way, our rate is not the 85, 90, 95% that we thought it was. It's really much closer to somewhere around 70%, with some schools at 50 and even 25 or 30% graduation rates. Now think about that. There are schools in America today, and we consider ourselves the land of opportunity, where everyone has an opportunity at success. Our founding charter says everyone's got a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And yet we're walking some kids into schools today where they can look right and look left, and one of them are going to graduate. That's not good enough. In Indiana, over a 4-year period, we start our freshman classes with roughly 85,000 students a year. Depends on the year, but that's roughly where it is. And we graduate 4 years later, roughly 65,000 students, losing about 20,000 students each year. The statistic I saw just recently, somebody else may talk about it tonight, or today, but every 9 seconds a student in America drops out. That reform was important because it set the environment for further reforms. When we first started talking about what we're going to do to reform dropout rates in Indiana, everybody looked at me and said, well, you know, we don't have a problem with dropout rates in Indiana. We're graduating 85, 90% of our kids. And I think people with good faith and goodwill, they just were kind of not I mean, it wasn't as if people didn't care. I think they cared a lot. But they were teaching the kids that were showing up, and they thought they were doing a pretty solid job. And they kind of knew in the back of their mind that we had smaller graduating classes than we had freshman classes, but they just sort of thought maybe they were going somewhere else. And there were 2 myths that I would hear as we go around and talk about this process that changed once we changed the way that we counted. The first was the bad apple, bad egg myth. Well, you can't keep those kids in school because, boy, if you keep them in school, I mean, you're going to ruin school for everybody else. You know, we can't. You're saying, you know, 5, 10% of the kids, they're just not good kids, and you know, gosh, we hope and we root for them, but they're not going to. Just, you know, we can't mess it up for everybody else. Well, that might make some sense when you're graduating 90, 95% of your kids, but when you start thinking about it, probably doesn't. But you can at least buy the logic. But once you acknowledge that it's 50, sometimes in some schools, 67, 70% of your kids that are dropping out, nobody believes that 30, 50, 70% of our kids are bad apples or bad eggs that we just can't reach. The second myth I would hear is, well, I mean, you know, some kids move. I'm here to tell you there's not a school system in Indiana, and I don't think there's a school system in the country that has a 110% graduation rate, okay? Where they're graduating, you know, 1,000 kids their senior year, and they started with 700. And when you really start to follow where these kids are going, you know, they're not just moving. We're losing them.